Okay, good evening, and welcome. Welcome to St. George's House in Conversation. I'm delighted that so many of you are able to be with us this evening, and I'm especially pleased to welcome back to St. George's House Philippe Sands QC. Many of you will know that Philippe gave the 2015 Elson Ethics Lecture, but his association with the House goes way beyond that. And I think his first visit was in 1993. So it's an especial pleasure, Philippe, to welcome you back. I wish it could be in person, and I hope that that day is not too far off. Those of you who have joined us this evening will know that Philippe is a leading barrister at Matrix Chambers. He's also a professor of law at University College London. He's the president of English Pen. And although he was an author before the Elson Ethics Lecture, he has become something of a stellar author since then, with two books: East West Street, a memoir about his family and the tragedy that beset them, and most recently, The Rat Line, which is the story of Otto and Charlotte Wächter. They are both tremendous books, and they're actually interrelated in their way. And I thought, Philippe, it would be interesting for our audience tonight to hear a little bit about the impetus behind the books. What drove you to write them? And maybe to say something about that interrelatedness.
Well, Gary, can I just begin by saying how incredibly nice it is to be back at St. George's House. It will soon be my 30th anniversary visit, which seems incredible, and it's been a very special place for me. So I'll take what I can get, and being with you virtually is an absolute joy. So, I'm an academic and a barrister, and for 25 years, 30 years, my work's basically dealt with the academic field. And then out of the blue, I got an invitation to give a lecture in what I thought was an obscure Ukrainian city, Lviv. And I discovered that Lviv was also Lemberg and Lvov in previous incarnations, a remarkable place. And it happened to be the place where my grandfather was born in 1904. He talked to me about it. So I accepted the invitation and did not for a minute in accepting the invitation imagine that I would end up writing numerous newspaper articles, two books, a film, a podcast, and there will soon be even a comic book coming out of it. And it all, I think, relates to the fact that it's about these two books, fundamental questions of human identity. I mean, who are we? Are we defined principally as individuals, or are we defined principally because we are members of a group, or more than one group? And I went on this exploration because I wanted to find out who my grandfather was, and in so doing, to know more about who I was and am. And in doing that, I covered, of course, the origins of these extraordinary concepts of crimes against humanity and genocide, and this extraordinary couple, Charlotta and Otto Wächter. Otto Wächter, of course, being the man who brought so much misery to my grandfather's family, seeing the elimination of 80 members of his family, and so of mine. But I've come to know the son, and also the son of Hans Frank, who was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer. And Nicholas Frank has become a very dear friend. It says a lot about the spirit of reconciliation. In the space of 70 years, one can build a firm friendship. And I am close to Horst Wächter also, but maybe we'll get into that in the conversation.
Yeah, indeed. And those must have been, in the early days, very tentative relationships to develop. Here you are, the son of a family who suffered terribly at the hands of the fathers of these people. So how did you negotiate that?
Well, I think trepidation is an understatement. It began in 2011. I was doing a case at the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, which happens to be based in Hamburg. I was acting for Bangladesh against Myanmar on the delimitation of the Bay of Bengal. which was actually a very interesting case. And I had tracked down Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, through a book he had written, published in Germany in 1987, called Der Vater, the Father, which actually is being published in July for the first time in England under the title The Father. It's an extraordinary book, and it's about Nicholas's relationship with his mass murdering father. I track him down. I tell him I'm going to be in Hamburg. I meet him. We make an appointment together on the banks of the River Elbe in the terrace of a rather wonderful hotel. And I'm very trepidatious. After all, this is a man, who's been, as a little child, around the Goerings and the Himmlers and the Hitlers, and you're one degree of separation from this terrible history. I needn't have worried at all. He's an extraordinary human being, a very fine journalist, and a very warm and humorous man. This is not humor, but troubling. The very first thing he said to me was, "Philippe, you have to understand I'm against the death penalty in all cases, except in the case of my father." And of course, as an opening line in a relationship of now 10 years, you never forget that. And he lives under this extraordinary burden. I had never turned my mind to what it might be like to be the child of a man who is hanged in the courtyard of Nuremberg's Palace of Justice for the murder of 4 million human beings. How do you live with that as a child and as an adult? And how does Nicholas's daughter live with that? And I've come to know them very, very well. And I've learned a great deal from them.
Yeah, and the two sons in particular take different approaches to the memory of their fathers, isn't that right? So the relationship between both of them must be particularly interesting.
Well, so one day Nicholas said to me, "Philippe, you're interested in Lemberg. Would you like to meet the son of the governor of Lemberg? He was my father's deputy. His name is Otto Wächter. He and his wife Charlotte produced 6 children. One of them is my friend Horst, who lives in northern Austria. Would you like to meet him?" I said, "I'd love to meet him. I don't know why he'd want to meet me, but if he's up for it, I'm up for it too." And he agreed to meet, and I traveled. I flew to Vienna and drove 80 kilometers north and went to this extraordinary Knights Templar, sort of 15th, 16th century old schloss, completely dilapidated. One of the most extraordinary places I've ever been, inhabited by a very delightful man in his late 70s, Horst Wächter, and his Swedish wife, Jacqueline. And I liked him immediately. He sort of turned up in a pink T-shirt and Birkenstocks, and he's lovely and gentle, but he takes a different view from his father. His line is, "It is my duty as a son to find the good in my father." So even if my father was the man who built the Krakow ghetto, the man who oversaw the mass murder of 500,000 human beings, there was good in him, and I must focus on that. And it was really, I've come to learn, the relationship with his mother, Charlotte, that was absolutely crucial. And they were friends back then, but actually something happened which caused the rat line to be written and their friendship to come to an end, which was that in the course of making a BBC documentary film, My Nazi Legacy, What Our Fathers Did, Nicholas suggested that Horst could be a new kind of Nazi, which he's not, totally not. And Horst was very upset, and they have basically not spoken since.
Yeah, I mean, I think just reading the rat line, one of the very interesting things for me is we know the horror that underlies it all, but was that sheer sense of normality as they were growing up. Charlotte is a very formidable woman. I find myself quite admiring her, very determined, knew what she wanted and went after it. Otto was something of a playboy's the wrong word, but yet underneath it all was this business of how Jewish people were perceived. It was almost in the DNA that they were to be despised and to be downtrodden. And yet all around them, life goes on as normal. And it's a wonderfully interesting snapshot of that part of the world between the wars.
Well, I mean, this is the complexity, isn't it, of human existence? I mean, what Horst did, which was extraordinarily generous from one perspective and immensely foolhardy from another, was to give to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., at my suggestion, the entire family archive, all the letters, all the diaries, all the photographs that passed between his mother and father over a 20-year relationship. And he gave me a copy of the whole also and said, sure, write about it. And that's what I've done. So we've got these amazing diaries and letters, and we are able to trace from the moment they met in April 1929 to the moment he dies in very mysterious circumstances in a Vatican-run hospital in Rome. And what you learn, of course, is that in many respects, they're very ordinary folk. A number of people have criticized me for never characterizing Otto or Charlotte, both deeply anti-Semitic, deeply racist human beings. I never call them monsters, and that's because I don't think they are monsters. I think they did monstrous things, but when you go through the letters and the diaries, it's also clear that they're capable of humanity, of love, of generosity, of decency, the kinds of human characteristics that we applaud and admire. And as you say, particularly after the war comes to an end in 1945, Charlotte is remarkable in her spousal duties and attending to the survival needs of her husband, going beyond what any reasonable spouse, I think, could ever be expected to do. And this is the fundamental question. How could people who are capable of such decency also be involved in such horrors? And I think that's the question that each of us as human beings wants to know the answer to.
Of course, and I hope we might come to that business of post-war when Otto was on the run and Charlotte's role in all of that. But I just wanted to go back to a moment in the book where Otto has the chance to go into legal practice and make a lot of money, or he can be in what we would now call public service. And he asks Charlotte what he should do.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a very famous day in Austrian, Nazi, and world history. It's the 15th of March, 1938, and many people who are watching will know that that was the day Adolf Hitler went to Vienna and was greeted. Some of you will know the photographs on the balcony of the Hofburg, overlooking the Heldenplatz, with hundreds of thousands, if not 1 million or more, deliriously happy Austrians. And on that balcony with the Führer, as Charlotte records in her diary, standing 1 meter from Adolf Hitler, were Otto and Charlotte.
Yeah.
She then records what happens afterwards, which is that they enter the building and walk down the massive markers. I don't know if you've been to the Hofburg, it's now a museum. Anyone can go, and you walk down the stairs, and at the bottom I got out her diary and I read what she'd written at that moment. And out on the staircase he says to her, "So now, my darling, I have a choice. I could resume my lucrative career in the law and we will live very well, or I could accept the offer made by our friend Arthur Seyss-Inquart, who goes on to be governor of Austria and then governor of Nazi-occupied Holland and is hanged at Nuremberg in 1946, along with Hans Frank, and get government. What should I do?" And she says, government. And singular moment, because I understand that the power relationship between the two of them at that time, she is very influential. I don't think we've ever fully understood the role of spouses in these political dramas. People tend, it's mostly men, now it's changing, of course, but men had partners, spouses, and what role of the spouses, and it was crucial. And the moment was decisive. They had 6 children and 23 grandchildren, and those descendants' lives have been forever changed by what happened in that passing moment. If he said, forget this nonsense, stop the Nazism, stop the discrimination, go back to your law office, be a commercial lawyer, the families would not have the burden that they live on now.
Yeah, of course. And indeed, nations may not have that burden either. But interestingly, when she persuaded him to go down that public route, as it were, that loyalty endured after the war. Hans Frank, of course, hanged at Nuremberg. but Otto gets away. He goes on the run, and Charlotta has a very key role to play in that. Maybe you would say something about that, because that reads like a thriller in many ways.
I mean, you literally couldn't invent it. Well-known spy thrillers writers have said to me that, Anthony Beevor has also said, if you were to write this as people would say simply not possible. So Otto disappears off the face of the earth. But thanks to the family archive, which so generously gave me a copy of, I was able, but with the help of some remarkable PhD and graduate students and Germanic studies and literature, to discover exactly what happened, because everything was coded. But basically, in a small Austrian village called Mariapfarr, he meets a young Waffen-SS soldier called Ratman, who is a part of a Waffen-SS division which survives in high altitudes, alpine conditions. And he says to Otto Wächter, I know who you are. I'll look after you. I'll take you where the British and the Americans are too lazy and stupid. I'll take you up to the mountains. Wächter's been indicted for mass murder, so he's a very wanted man. And he hides for 3.5 years in the Ost Mountains, the Hohenzollern, just very close to Salzburg, where Charlotte is living. And every 2 weeks, we work out from the material, Charlotte brings provisions, newspapers, shoes, socks, skis, at great cost to herself, physical hardship, meeting him in these obscure shepherds' huts at 2,500 meters. They're both avid sports people, mountaineers and climbers, and he survives. And one of the more surreal moments, which I describe in the book, was I wanted to know from Horst, what was Bukko Ratman like? This young man who saved his father and befriended Charlotta. Why did he do what he did? And Horst smiled and looked at me and said, want to know about Bukko? I said, yes, I'd like to know about Bukko. And he said, well, I can tell you everything you want to know about Bukko, or we could telephone him. Okay, so this is 2016. It's 2017. It's 71 years after the end of the war. It never occurred for a single moment that Ratman might still be around, but we did telephone him, and 6 weeks later we went to visit him. It was the more surreal experiences. I learned how firsthand they followed the Nuremberg trial from the great heights, of the mountains above Salzburg, and how in the summer of 48, Otto decided he would go on the right migratory route and he would escape to Argentina. And Bukko told me the entire story. I should say that as Bukko told me the entire story, some people will be peering over your shoulder and at the bookshelf behind you. What's he reading? What's he got on his bookshelf? I was doing, there was a little black and white photograph. I've put it in the book. And only after the interview finished, after about 5 hours, that I got up, went and had a look at the bookshelf. It was a photograph of Adolf Hitler in January 2017, which I thought was rather telling. The good eyes, it might be said.
Yeah, extraordinary. And then, of course, Otto, en route to Argentina, winds up in Rome and had some assistance from the Catholic Church.
Well, I'm very careful how I write about this because he had the assistance of a very well-known, I would say notorious, senior bishop, an Austrian bishop called Alois Hudal. He never mentions him by name in the diaries or in the letters. Everything is coded. So it took us some years, I would say, to work out who was whom. We worked 100% accuracy, but Alois Hudal is infamous, I think, because he helped Müller and Barbie and may have helped Eichmann also, all of them to escape. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of people, some very, very famous people. And he was a Nazi bishop and he would meet people. In Otto's first letter home from Rome, he simply tells Charlotta, I've met the very friendly religious gentleman, which of course is Hudal. One of the things we don't know exactly is who Hudal was assisted by. He had been very close to Pius XII until the early 1940s, but they grew apart. And so we do not know whether the Pope assisted or even knew what he was up to, although Gita Sereni, in one of her books, does find some evidence that the Pope may have given him a small sort of stipend to assist on his humanitarian activities. But we don't know. What I did discover, which was a huge shock, was that throughout this entire period, Hugh Dahl was a spy for the Americans. Right. He was being paid $50 a month in cash to report to the Americans on Nazis he had given refuge to. So the Americans knew everything. Wächter had a false identification. Alfredo Reinhardt he had become, and Hugh Dahl reported to his American superior, the wonderfully named Thomas Lucid. You couldn't invent it. That Wächter had arrived, that he'd been put up in the Vigna Pia monastery. Gainful employment had been found for him as a film extra at Cinecittà, appearing with Tito Gobbi in Verdi, the film of Verdi's Forza del Destino. I mean, you literally couldn't invent this. And it turned out that the Americans were trying to recruit these kind of characters.
Right. So the Americans knew he was there, knew exactly who he was, didn't pick him up because they wanted to recruit them.
Well, they'd recruited some. I mean, things end dramatically for Wächter when he goes to visit an old comrade. He never again mentions him, but the old comrade he visits at Lake Albano, which you will know is the lake under Castel Gandolfo, the previous home of the popes, until Pope Francis decided, no, I don't want to live in such opulence anymore. And we've discovered the identity. I won't give away the name because that person too is a notorious mass murderer who will go on and be sentenced to life imprisonment for the greatest crime in Italian history. He is either poisoned on that weekend at Lake Albano, which is Horst's theory, or he falls ill having swum in polluted waters and caught leptospirosis, Weil's disease, which is more, I think, my theory of what happened. But there are two theories as to how he met his untimely end in the extraordinary Santo Spirito Hospital in Rome.
Of course. Well, and even after death, Otto's story is extraordinary, and again involving Charlotta.
I think it's fair to say he loved her man. There is a chapter in the book entitled The Five Burials of O.W. I don't have time to go through all of them, but I'll just give you this little anecdote to chew on. Otto Wächter dies on the 13th of July, 1949. He's buried on the 16th of July, 1949, in the Catholic part of the Verano Cemetery, the foreigners section, on the 16th of July. 10 years later, Alois Hugh Dahl, who by now has retired as a bishop, basically booted out by Pope Pius XII because he's caused him so much difficulty with all these people he's been giving refuge to, gets in touch with Charlotte and says, oh, I forgot to tell you that as your husband lay dying in my arms, he did say to me he wanted to be buried in the homeland. Why don't you come and get him? She obtains permission to get him exhumed from the Verona cemetery, but not to take him out of Italy. So she arranges to have him transported to Sicily, Palermo, where she has a daughter who's married an Italian and is going to build a mausoleum. Sends her car down to collect the remains and drive him down to Palermo. They never arrive, and the trail goes cold. In the documents Horst gives, I find two press clippings from 1960 newspapers. Body of SS mass murderer goes, and Interpol on the hunt for the body. And I say to Horst, what happened? Again, he gives me one of his warm smiles. What happened to father? Mother came and got him. I said, no, mother came and got him. What did mother do with him after she got him? She said she brought him home. How did she bring him home? In her car. and drove him to Austria. Well, what did she do with him? We buried him in the garden of House Wartenberg, the small pension mother was operating as a German language school. And ever since the book has come out, I've had a steady stream of emails and letters from former students all over the world of the House Wartenberg saying they had no idea that she was married to such a notorious Nazi, or that he was buried in the garden in which they would have their breakfast every morning. She went on to bury him. Every time she moved house, she'd exhume him one more time and move his remains to where she moved to.
Extraordinary. Absolutely.
Welcome to Charlotte Wächter. She
Yeah.
didn't invent her.
Yeah, and another interesting coincidence, Philippe, coincidence, I think is the word, is you were friendly with John le Carré. In fact, your neighbours or were neighbours up until his sad death. And le Carré, I think I'm right in saying, was in Italy in 1949 while Otto was there.
Well, I must confess I got very confused because I'd been helped by a couple of wonderful academics in the United States, David Kurtzer at Brown, Norman Goder in Florida. Norman is United States' leading experts on CIA and US Army archives. And it was he who uncovered all this incredible stuff about Hugh Dahl and, all these spy ring that had been created in 1947, Project Los Angeles, which I write about in the book. But I couldn't believe that the Americans knew where Wächter was, had indicted him, and hadn't done anything about it. So le Carré, real name David Cornwall, who my neighbor for 20 years, I just rang him up and said, look, I'm very confused. Can I come and talk to you about this? He said, send me a few documents. Tell me the basic story. I'll look into it and then bring some cakes and we'll talk about it. So I went over with cakes and he said, well, this is all very interesting. 1949, I was there. I said, what do you mean you were there? He said, well, I was 18 years old. I was a young British soldier. I was stationed in Linz, and my job was to question German military types and former soldiers and SS people. I said, what, to look for mass murderers, to prosecute them? He said, no, it was completely perplexing. We'd all turned on a sixpence, was the expression he used. They were our friends now, and so we were recruiting them against the new enemy, which was the Soviets, the Bolsheviks.
Yeah, my enemy's enemy is my friend.
Yes, and said as an 18-year-old, it was immensely confusing because he'd been grown up to be told the Nazis were the worst of the worst. I should say that for anyone who's interested in hearing John le Carré's voice on this, I made a BBC podcast series called The Rat Line, which is free. You can just go on the BBC website or BBC Sounds, look for The Rat Line and go to episode 6, and you can hear the very moment where I discover this with David Cornwall, John le Carré, and you hear the incredulity in my voice because I couldn't believe what he was telling me.
Yeah. And then later life, le Carré's later life, you helped him with his novels in a small way, didn't you? Well,
we met in about 2003 in our local pub, the Wells Tavern, for anyone who lives near Hampstead, you'll know it. And I don't know, at some point very early on, he said, look, as you know, I despise lawyers, but I write about them. I love writing about them. There was some ghastly lawyer in his, everyone who knows le Carré knows that. Yeah. Some ghastly, opportunistic, appalling lawyer. But he finds them fascinating. And so my job became, and I did it for about 10 novels, to check whether the depicted lawyer dressed like a lawyer, sounded like a lawyer, acted like a lawyer. And that was my limited role. He would turn up at the front door. He'd just be standing there with his 300 pages of manuscript printed out on the home printer. Usual procedure, Philippe, usual procedure, David. And my job would check the lawyers. And it was, what a privilege though, because as you know, he was a remarkable man. If any of you have ever listened to his voice, I've just had the great happiness of making an archive hour on the life of John le Carré. Just his voice is so captivating. What a joy to have known him.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way he turns up in his own films. In the films, just the small cameo roles that he always plays.
Well, and you'll be delighted to know that he ended up an Irishman.
He did, yes,
Which
indeed.
people did not know until the broadcast a few weeks ago, as a consequence of which he's now been elevated to the pantheon of Irish great authors
Indeed.
instantaneously.
He's got family in County Cork. Bless him. Bless
Absolutely,
him.
absolutely.
And Philippe, just going back a moment, when you were doing the research around the rat line, and indeed with East-West Street, I was aware reading them of that sense of populism, the rise of the charismatic, but with hindsight, utterly unprincipled leader, and that sense of a society in thrall. And do you see echoes of that today? Are we just going around in circles, really?
Charismatic, unprincipled leaders. I wonder who might come to mind.
Yeah.
I'm afraid I do. And one of the subtexts of the rat line is, I suppose, a message about what happens when we allow people to cross lines that seem initially inconsequential. But once someone like Otto Wächter has been allowed to cross one line and get away with it, he feels a little lighter about crossing the next one and the next one and the next one. And then one thing leads to another. And then he's involved in mass murder on an industrial scale. And the skies never tumble in on him, which I think is why right now I watch with particular interest what's happening, whether, they don't seem like huge things, a prime minister who wants to get his flat decorated and borrows a few bob or accepts a few bob from some mate. But actually, these things are incredibly important. It's how certain things begin. I think it was in the United States that was more problematic. And I wrote a piece recently, you can get it online, it's free, in the New Yorker magazine. If you just type in New Yorker Sans Ratline, I wrote a piece about a video that the actor Arnold Schwarzenegger had put on the web a few days after the 6th of January events in Washington, D.C., when mobsters, sort of a mob, invaded the Capitol. And the video is interesting. Schwarzenegger basically says, look, I'm Austrian. I know about these things. We need to be very, very careful. And I think that's one of the lessons of these books. Things can spiral out of control.
Yeah, I think that's the sense I got from this, that we really do tend to go round in circles historically, as it were. But I'm right in thinking that it was Nuremberg that led us to the whole issue of crimes against humanity and genocide as legal entities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, an absolutely seminal moment. We're actually in the 75th year. It was the 75th anniversary of the start of the trial last November the 20th. I had the great honor and privilege of being invited by the president of Germany to be with him in courtroom 600 on that day, which was amazing. I did think to myself as I was standing there with him, in fact, he's a lovely man, and I mentioned it to him, what my grandfather would have thought if I had said to him 60 years ago, guess what, I'll be with the German president in courtroom 600. I mean, it was very simple. And this will be the 70th anniversary of the judgment. And that judgment is, of course, hugely important because it opened the door to the idea of international criminal justice. And with that, the proceedings in Rwanda, in Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Court, and the allegations we have now about genocide in Myanmar with the Rohingya and the Uyghurs, and so on and so forth. So all roads lead to Nuremberg. If Nuremberg had not happened, we would not have the word genocide or the concept of crimes against humanity invented by these remarkable jurists, Hersch Lauterpacht and Raphael Lemkin.
Yeah.
And the world, I'm not starry-eyed about international law. The inventions have not stopped the horrors, but they've at least given us bits of paper which allow us to say, no, this is not permissible behavior. And that is, I think, not without significance.
Yeah, and I'm interested too in the business of, particularly with the two sons, Hans Frank's son and Otto's son, and the different approaches that they took. There's something quite clean about the time itself. When it happens, there are the facts, but it's the generations afterwards, the legacy, and how that is dealt with that really goes to the heart of this.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of Spain, the Spanish Civil War, even my own part of the world, Northern Ireland. How do future generations deal with it? Some say don't talk about it at all, the pact of forgetting. Others say you've got to really dig deep and think it through and essentially deal with it. What do you think? What was your sense, particularly from the German angle?
Well, I mean, you've read maybe this marvelous book by Patrick Radden Keefe, Say Nothing. One of the most extraordinary books I read last year.
Yeah.
Well, I grew up on one side of the story where no one would talk about it. I mean, that's why I went to Lviv. My mother wouldn't talk about it. My grandfather wouldn't talk about it. What I learned from Nicholas and Horst was that the other side didn't talk about it either. I think not talking about it is not the answer. What we learn, including through psychoanalytical work, is that the secrets of others do not disappear. They come back and they haunt. I got an extraordinary letter on Christmas Day. The Rat Line had just come out in Germany, Die Rattenlinie, and an Austrian historian wrote to me to say, a most remarkable thing has happened, Professor Sands, and I write to you about it. I was given a copy of the Rat, and I noticed in the early pages, my great-grandfather, Robert Winterstein, mentioned. He was the prosecutor, the public procurator general, the chief prosecutor, who was moved from his position, a very distinguished lawyer, removed from his position after the Germans arrived in March 1938, stripped of his pension rights, sent to Buchenwald, where he perished. The family has had the letter that removed him from his position, but we could never decipher the signature, and there was no name typed at the bottom. Now, with your book, I have come to learn that the sender of the letter was Otto Wächter. But that's not why I'm writing to you. I'm writing to you because for the last 40 years, and I live, she says, in my great-grandfather's house in Vienna, for the last 40 years, closest friend and my next door neighbor is Otto Wächter's granddaughter. And I shall now have to share with her this news about our historical connections that we were not aware of until today. And that's the kind of legacy that silence brings. And it's complicated. And you know it as well as anyone, Gary. It's no different. There's nothing unique to the German, Ukrainian, Polish, Jewish story. It's a universal silence. Northern Ireland, Rwanda, Yugoslavia, South America, Argentina, all of the cases that I work on, it's the same kinds of.
Yeah, and I suppose in some ways the ultimate enemy, if that's the right word, is this normalization of horror, which happens time and again. But
you know, Gary, it's not just in, we've got it now. I've been thinking about it a lot in relation to the issue last year with the toppling of the statues in Bristol and elsewhere. And we have a history in this country too, and we've never really engaged with it. I went back recently. My history books at school, I don't know, it was a book by Treese called This Is Your Century. And it had a chapter called Sunset on Empire. And honestly, I mean, it beggars belief the way it describes the colonial era issue of race, what I was taught, the celebration of the wonders of the United Kingdom and Britain. And I was taught nothing about that colonial history. Only now do I come to it.
Of course. Well, we are running out of time, Philippe, and I know you have engagements ahead of you, but I just want to take you back briefly to that 2015 lecture where you took as your title, Britain, Europe and Human Rights, What Next? And we were in the throes of Brexit at the time. Brexit has happened. What's your take on that now? Is it too soon to say? Has anything changed?
Soon to say. I think we're in the period, and of course, COVID, terrible COVID that's been so difficult for so many people, and I hope everyone who's on is well and safe, has masked a lot of the things. But the reality is, from my perspective, Britain feels like quite an isolated place now. cut off really legally from Europe, rather adrift in the world, no longer a major player on a lot of the issues. I worry. There are little things now. When I want to send a copy of my book, I have to go to the post office and I have to fill out a customs declaration form, and I have to pay an extra £6.98 on a £15 book to be able to send it to my family in France. I mean, how tragic is that?
Yeah,
we've literally gone backwards. For what benefit? I mean, what advantage that we have had? We're in control of our laws. We're weaker, we're poorer, we're lonelier. Are we more sovereign? Frankly, I doubt it. Ask the poor fishermen of Brixham in Devon, where I've recently spent some time, or the cheesemakers of Cheshire, or the independent maker of items of clothing has tried to sell in Europe and give up because they can't sell anymore because there's so much red tape. What it's done, I think, is it will strengthen the sense of a corporate takeover, because the only companies that can actually take advantage of this situation will be the very large companies, and the independent and solo small boutiques, companies, booksellers, whatever they are, will find that they can't compete. And I think that's absolutely tragic, which is why I think in 20 years' time, there will be a reversal of what has happened, because I don't think Britain, at least in an economic and political sense, perhaps morally people will feel we're more in control. But personally, I feel it's a tragedy what's happened. And of course, one can't say that because it's disrespectful of those who supported it, which I don't intend at all. I think essentially people were lied to. And there's no reason that they could not believe that the claims that were being made were not true. But I've got it imprinted on my mind now. We spend a lot of time in Devon, fishing communities. They've not sold a single fish or oyster or crab since the 1st of January. It's just gone. It's just gone.
And I mean, we could talk all night on these topics, but I know we can't. So I was delighted to see that the Ratline is the Waterstones Book of the Month.
It's very lovely.
East West Street has already picked up numerous prizes. I have no doubt the Ratline is going to do the very same. But what's next for you as an author?
I've got 2 more books coming out. I've got one coming next year, 2022, which is on a place called Chagos, and it's on decolonization. It's called The Last Colony, Britain's last colony in Africa, the British Indian Ocean Territory. And that will come out in September next year. And then the third in the trilogy, I suspect it will be the last one, on the East West Street and Ratline, is just as Otto Wächter was a minor character in East West Street, there is a minor character in the Ratline called Walter Rauff, who was Wächter's comrade and friend. And guess what became of Walter Rauff? He did escape. He did get to South America, and he ended up working for Augusto Pinochet's regime in Chile. And that case and his file landed on my desk in October 1998 when Augusto Pinochet was arrested. So you couldn't invent it. The story comes full circle. What started with my grandfather's birth in 1904 ends up with a brief in my barrister's chambers in London, 1998. People forget that Pinochet was arrested for crimes against humanity and genocide.
Indeed. I think the planets are just aligned in your favor. There's no question.
Who knows?
Philippe, it's been a great pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for making the time tonight. And I hope our audience, if they haven't already got the Ratline, will make sure to get a copy of it. It really is a terrific book, a humbling book, a thriller of a book, and a book from which many lessons, I think, can be learned. Let me say thank you also to all of you who have joined us. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and I look forward to seeing you again before very long. But Philippe, for now, thank you and good
Thank you so
night.
much. I hope to see you in person very soon.
I hope so. Good
Bye.
night.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.